little homework review. Oh wait, we didn't do the, I don't think I did this last week either, the land acknowledgement. Does anyone want to chime in on the land acknowledgement, telling us what ancestral lands they're on? You can put it in the chat as well if you want. I could call names if you want.
Can you tell us how we can check? I think it's Satavian where I live, but is there
Yeah, there's a website that I think she put it in the last time, but it's native. You can Google native land, and
Okay.
it's a website it's like native-land, I think .org. I'm not sure what the ending is, but if you Google native land, it should be the first thing that comes up. It's basically a map that let me see if I can. Anyone else want? If anyone could put that in the chat.
Okay, I'll look for it and I'll put it in the chat.
Thanks. That's perfect. That's excellent. Yeah. Okay. This is David, right? David Dalk. Yeah. I'm part of Tongva lands in mid-sea. Okay. Yeah. Okay. So Tongva, a lot of you guys are going to be Tongva land if you're in LA proper. Same. Margaret is the same in North Hollywood. Yes. Great. Yeah, I'm still beaming to you guys from Kumi Island down south here. And the closest one for me, the closest village is Encino de los Bosques, or also called San Antonio Necua. They are very close actually from where I'm at right now. Their current reservation, but they actually had the lands of this whole kind of region all the way to the ocean. Okay, so I guess land acknowledgement, thank you guys for sharing. And yeah, if David, you can put that in the chat, the native land, I'd really appreciate it so other people can check it out for next week. Homework review, it was pretty self-explanatory. You guys all seem to really get it. Any notes you want to make or comments about the homework, about the rebates, and or even if it's just like a comment like, wow, I was surprised that was more money than I thought or less money than I thought. Thank you, Connie. You said also Tongva. Anybody have anything from the homework review? Or also mentioning, I know we didn't really have time in the last irrigation or the last class to talk about the irrigation calculation one. I know a lot of people had trouble with that. If anyone wants to talk about that or have any questions about any of the homeworks, really. Thank you, Jason, for putting that in the chat. Ernesto, you're on Chumash land bordering the Tongva lands, right? Okay. So yeah, a lot of Tongva and then borderlands on bordering Tongva lands, neighbors. Yeah, anyone want to mention? I wanted to, for the homework of the previous homework, which was the irrigation calculation one, I didn't get to talk, we didn't have much time. But one thing I know that came up, and I'm not sure if I clarified or not, was the calculating with the drip irrigation. And there's kind of a formula that said gallons per hour times 1.605, which is just a constant. And then you divide it by the area. And some folks were confused by that because really, like I said, the class doesn't really go into calculating your precipitation rate. But I want to just clarify, if you are using that little formula, the gallons per hour times that constant divided by the area for drip, you have to basically think about this. The area is regarding the space that, or the area that one emitter is watering, and typically that's going to be dependent on the spacing of your emitters. So if you have drip tape, you usually have this grid pattern, so you can actually calculate the distance between the emitters and on both sides, and that kind of gives you the square footage for the area being watered. Does anyone know what I'm talking about? Totally confused, but I know there's a lot of questions in the math, so I just wanted to clarify that. Anyone else have any? Wow, you guys are really silent today, or is my my thing all messed up? But either way, yeah, it seems like the rebates was very self-explanatory. It seemed like you guys understood Martha's presentation. I didn't see a lot of confusion about the rebates. So I didn't feel like we needed to really review it that much unless anyone wants to kind of share anything that's cool that they found out. I do know that, I can't remember who now, but someone is in Pasadena and they actually shared what they found for Pasadena's rebates, which are very similar to a lot of the ones offered by SoCal Water Smart, so the ones in LADWP. But then there was additional ones, like even just replacing plants with native plants. There's, I think, like a $200 max that was in there. And then there's someone, Brittany's in Bakersfield, and she's definitely looking for rebates in that area. SoCal Water Smart doesn't cover Bakersfield, we found out. But if you guys know of anything regarding kind of rebates up there in Bakersfield, put it in the chat, because I know Brittany's looking. Okay, going back to the math part, I see in the chat, math makes my head hurt. Couldn't we just discuss texture, moisture, and depth? Yes, I know. It is the math. I know I'm not actually really a math person at all. And it does make my head hurt. And I kind of have to see numbers and like write them down to be able to understand something. And I think the point is for this class is like the assumption with the curriculum is that you guys are all landscape professionals and maybe know about precipitation rates because their aim audience is landscapers. So a lot of landscapers know the kind of how to do the precipitation rate, especially with irrigation systems like sprinklers. And it's kind of aimed at those folks who understand that and know how to do that. So it's hard because many of us don't have that background. And so it kind of feels like, whoa, a lot of math that I don't have the background for. So it's very simple if we had more time. I don't want anyone to feel like I'm just stupid, I don't understand math. That's not the case. We really didn't really get to touch on it that much. So I tried to simplify and throw in some little formulas, but I know that that can be more confusing sometimes. But that being said, I just want to emphasize, if you are really unfamiliar with the math, just trying to find the precipitation rate is really helpful. It's a helpful start. And yeah, but yes, knowing the texture and moisture and depth is really important, Margaret, but also knowing precipitation rates is really helpful when you get into irrigation systems and not overwatering or underwatering, like actually doing a nice deep watering is important. And then David says, to be clear, I use the formula for a sprinkler as well. Are you saying we shouldn't use this? I can't remember your homework specifically. I know I responded to a lot of people, but the sprinkler formulas are totally fine to use. I think you're referring to the one that's the gallons per minute times 96.3 divided by area, David, but I'm not sure. And you can totally use that. If you know the formula well and you know what you're doing, that's great. It's really mostly, we just want to start from the precipitation rate. And if you have the precipitation rate, you have the inches per, inches per hour. So it's like, those are your units, right? And so if we start with that, all you have to do is put in, like, start with the, however many inches you want to put down. So 1.5 was the example in the class. You do 1.5 divided by your precipitation rates. So it's like inches divided by inches per hour, and that cancels out the inches and leaves you with the hours. And that was the kind of formula, let's say, for figuring out the time to put down 1.5 inches. And the formula for precipitation rate, well, there's many, and I'm hesitant to say it because it sometimes adds more confusion, but the one I had suggested in class was for precipitation rate, which the units are inches per hour, was if you're using drip and you have gallons per hour given, because that's usually like 0.6 gallons per hour, you do the gallons per hour multiplied by 1.605, which is a constant that just basically is helping convert from inches to or gallons to inches. So gallons per hour times 1.605, and then you divide that by the area each emitter is watering. And there's a very similar one for sprinklers that you can use similarly, and you divide it by the whole area, and you take into account, you can do gallons per minute in that case. But again, it sounds a lot more complicated. Really, I think knowing just the precipitation rate and being able to calculate from that precipitation rate how to get inches or how to get the time that you need. And that's really kind of just goes back to that kind of old school removing, canceling out units type of thing. I'm not a math teacher, guys, so sorry if I make it worse. Anyway, any other questions? Well, not that anyone's really said any questions, but any comments before we jump into
I'm here, Claire. I'm here. I got one email from someone with their name as they want it to appear in the certificate. I won't be checking my email very long. So if you can drop your name in the chat exactly how you want it, that way I can also take roll at the same time and print as we go. You only have
perfect.
You only have until next Friday.
Nice.
Good,
So guys,
good job, everyone.
make sure to send in the chat to Brenda the name as your full name as you want it to appear on your certificate. And that's great. Same
Please
thing,
and thank
attendance
you.
at the same time.
Yes, thank you so much.
Okay. Thank you. Okay, so I'm going to get into this one. As usual, there's kind of a lot. Basically, we're talking about weeds today and IPM, which is short for integrated pest management. So mostly just talking about IPM techniques and some of the main kind of pests and diseases you might see in the native garden. So we're going to start with weeding, and then we'll kind of get into pests and what's it called? Pests and diseases type things. So with weeds, obviously, like weeding is just the act of the act of just removing unwanted plants from whatever area. So there isn't like a definition like this is a weed and this isn't for the most part. And it's just kind of a relative term, it's just something you don't want there. So you really want to make sure that you talk to a client about some plants that other people might consider weedy. Some folks might really want. I believe this photo actually is everlasting cudweed, which looks like a weed to many people, but it is a native plant. So it's like, depending on your client, you want to be sure you know that you're on the same page about what the weeds are, what weed is, what they consider a weed. Anyway, so just make sure that you're on the same page there. And generally speaking, we've talked about this, but weeding is really important in the first couple years to stay on top of, so that it doesn't get out of control, especially the first, right after installing a new garden. And a lot of times, once you install the garden, if that garden is used to kind of more conventional watering, once you switch to native garden, which is typically a bit less, a lot of your weeds go away on their own. But you're always going to have weeds, and weeds is just a normal part of maintenance. So there's basically so weed control, really, really essential, especially early on in the native garden's life, because they can get out of hand and outcompete your native plants. So there's essentially kind of two factors that determine whether the weeds kind of overtake or win and get out of control. And it's these kind of two technical terms that are, excuse me, that are high propagule pressure and high seed mass. High propagule, excuse me, high propagule pressure refers to annual weed seeds that are usually present in your soil in like really large quantities. Just they already exist there. It's kind of like, you can think of it as the weed seed bank. So high propagule pressure means you have a big number of weed seeds in your soil. And this is very typical to have, especially in our urban landscape. And these weed seeds are usually just ready and waiting for their triggers, which are sun, which is there's plenty of once you've removed all the vegetation and have planted out a new thing. And soil disturbance is another trigger, which is very normal to do when you're planting out stuff. And then the last is water. So sun, soil, and water are these weeds triggers, and they're just waiting for that. And you have tons of seeds. So that's one of the reasons you want to be on top of it, because they are ready and raring to go. And then secondly, there's the high seed mass, which refers to the fact that these weed plants typically are really good at producing a lot of seeds, even if they have a short lifespan. So they're very like prolific. So this combo makes them very effective at kind of smothering out other things. So the weed seed bank is high, but also those weeds, if they do seed, throw out a lot of seeds in the end. So that's kind of this, all these two factors and all this technical jargon is really summed up well in this kind of adage of 1 year seeds is 7 years weeds. And that makes sense. Like, you know, really, if you do one, if you let the seed, a weed go to seed and let it throw out its seed, you're actually creating the conditions for higher propagal pressure, right? So more 7 years of seeds, you're potentially adding a lot more to the seed bank. And that's why you want to make, it becomes kind of the cyclical thing of, if you're not staying on top of your weeds, they get out of control really quickly and escalate. So that, yeah.
Well, Claire, excuse me, this is kind of an interesting concept to me, but you know, for me, I always have problems with Bermuda.
Yes.
So is Bermuda, I mean, does that have a seed? I kind of just feel like it has its roots in the.
Yeah, so it propagates by stolons.
Stolons,
which are, yeah, so it, but it does also set seed, surprisingly.
Yeah.
It just is one of the weeds that can propagate multiple ways. And traditionally it does do that kind of stolen thing where it keeps going invasively sideways. So yes, that is actually why it's so effective and invasive, because it has multiple ways to propagate. So this is referring to weed seeds, yes. But it kind of makes sense for even a Bermuda grass type, because if you don't stay on top of the Bermuda grass, each of those stolons break off or fall off and are able to kind of like keep recreating more weeds. So it's kind of like Medusa's heads or snake heads, you know what I mean? You with the Bermuda grass. So similar concept in that it's maybe not referring to the seeds, though they do produce seed. It definitely is something you want to stay on top of, and especially in the first couple of years of your garden. I can't emphasize it enough. Because really, if you stay on top of it early in the establishing years of the garden, the native plants actually, you're kind of giving them a head start, and they're capable of starting to outcompete those weed seeds. And that's because as they're kind of, you know, they'll start to kind of diminish those triggers that the weed seeds have, which is like, you know, as their canopies get larger, they'll shade more of the, you know, of the soil, so there's less sun. And also, hopefully you're not disturbing the soil anymore when you have like perennials in place and stuff. So that's another trigger that you're not messing with. But yeah, it's just mostly with weed seeds, you really want to make sure that you're staying on top of it. This doesn't mean you'll never have any weeds, because like was just mentioned, clearly there's weeds that aren't just by seed, and there's always kind of like problem areas, and you always kind of have annual seeds, but this is really critical early on to kind of keep it under control. We're going to talk a little bit about techniques for weed control. So, you know, how to, first of all, there's mechanical, which is just, you know, removing, like physically removing a weed by either pulling it or tilling or using a fork or a trowel or cutting it, you know, basically, or a hoe. These are the mechanical methods for removing weeds. And actually, a lot of the new theories about weed control tell us that we shouldn't be pulling them, especially, or you know, tilling the soil with a fork or a trowel, because you're disturbing the soil, and that not only brings up new weed seeds, but also remember, it's going to break up that mycorrhizal network and that soil ecology, and that we want to keep intact. So they actually kind of are going more towards not doing or encouraging you to actually cut it back to the soil. So in this example, this is not a weed, I believe, but it looks like a potted plant, but you cut it all the way back to the soil level, the weeds, and actually come back and keep clipping it back to ground level until the plant actually exhausts its reserves and kind of completely dies. This is very hard to do in reality, in certain, you know, in a maintenance setting. Sometimes you just can't sit there and do that, or even in like Bermuda grass case, it's kind of difficult to do or stay on top of, but it's definitely something to consider for in situations where it can work. Even, or if you, sometimes I even suggest it maybe there's like collinear hoes. They're like a thin kind of like almost wire hoe. And yes, that's physically disturbing the soil, but it only disturbs like the kind of upper portion. So at least you're not like digging with a big fork or trowel to like disturb too as much. So it's kind of like find your happy medium, I suppose. One thing I know that before I get into it, that Carol Bornstein mentioned. Carol Bornstein is like, she has that book that everybody has. It's called California Native Plants for the Garden, I think, something kind of a title I can't really remember, but it's very easy. She talks about actually a good tip for weed control, in that she talks about like our tendency usually is to, like, especially in a Bermuda grass case, to go and attack like that biggest, most unruly patch of weeds and be like, okay, I'm gonna hack at that. And she said it's actually better to go after the newly establishing kind of weeds or patches that are starting to pop up in the more pristine areas. You want to get those first, is what she says, because it's important to break that cycle of establishment. I mean, just like the native plants that are getting established, weeds can get established, especially like a Bermuda grass. So you want to get the little guys early because they're easier to kind of destroy earlier, and then again break that cycle. And like those large patches, the unruly patches that you kind of always have, that's something that you can kind of hack back once you maintained keeping those pristine areas cool, or without weeds. Okay, so cultural. This is usually just maintaining conditions such that the weeds are just less likely to establish. And typically this is mulch. This just means mulch. It can also be like maybe growing a very low ground cover, something like that, that kind of smothers the weeds. But yeah, typically cultural would be mulch, which is after the first two, so mulch is going to smother the weeds, cover it so that sun doesn't get through. And that's why it's important to have good coverage and like at least 2 to 3 inches of mulch. And just make sure you don't get it all up against the stems or trunks, and be careful about overwatering, because the mulch kind of hides the moisture. You can't really see if the soil is moist or not. So always make sure you're actually kind of pulling it away when you're checking it for soil moisture. Just see. Yeah, this is also, mulch is kind of one of the main reasons you put mulch in a new garden is for this weed control, essentially. Okay, so then there is soil solarization. This is a method that people use, which is kind of typically used more for like before you plant out an area, to clear the area of weed seeds, or maybe a lawn. And you can use it in like spot conditions, but yeah, kind of because of the need to keep it all intact under a tarp. Sometimes it's not, like, it doesn't make sense for certain situations. But essentially what you want to do is clear all the above ground vegetation, just get rid of it at the site, and then moisten it well, like water it well, so that the water at least gets down like 6 to 8 inches, so that there's some moisture in the soil, and then cover it with a clear plastic tarp, like a UV resistant clear tarp or sheet. They sell these things. And then you hold it in place with either like landscape staples or soil. You can see in the picture there, they just kind of seal it with like big piles of soil. And then you let it sit for 4 to 8 weeks. And usually you want to do this like at the peak of summer, like the hottest months, the hottest time of year, because you want to actually kind of cook the seeds, cook the weed seeds and cook whatever's in there. And truly you're like actually kind of steaming it. And that's why you want to water it. If you do it dry, like you don't water anything and just put the tarp down, it's just less effective. So if you're going to go through the trouble, I say water it first so that they kind of you might see some growth, but if it's sealed well enough, they just kind of like, die, what's it called? Die alive. What is it? Gosh, you guys, today's not a good one for me. I can already tell. Okay, so yes.
I just want to mention on the mulch, I used the straw. I took a gardening class and they recommended straw, and I was very happy with the weed control. There was a couple little sprouts, but aside from that, I've had very little weeds, and it was really easy to apply. because you just put the bale on the ground and it's really light, so it's
Yeah.
not a lot of work. But I had a question, so I wanted to share that, but I had a question on
Yeah,
the,
thank you.
oh yeah, the covering the soil part with plastic, the solarization. If there's one area that I'm considering doing that, but there's a tree. It's actually in a parkway, there's a tree.
Interesting.
Yeah, there's a pine tree, it might be about 10, 15 feet tall. And then in the tree well, there's all this Bermuda grass, and it's
Yeah.
even growing in the sidewalks and stuff. And would that negatively impact the tree, do you think?
That is
Because it's
such an
all around the
interesting,
tree.
yeah, that's such an interesting example. It's interesting because I think it would be hard to seal it really well, first of all.
Yeah, right.
But I would tend to think like a more resilient type of tree, like you said, it's, like a pine, they tend to be pretty resilient. So
Yeah, they can take the heat. These
so
pine
I would
trees-
kind of think they would be okay, but it is going to heat up the soil, so I guess I really don't know from experience, but I guess my
Yeah.
recommendation would be either do a patch of it or something,
Right.
or just be like, I don't, not be, if you're not worried about losing the tree, you know what I mean? If you're worried about losing the tree, then I think actually even like a chemical situation might make more sense. But I think it's definitely worth the scientific investigation of it, because I'm really curious. Like, I'm like, I don't know. I kind of,
Yeah.
because typically it doesn't heat the soil that much. It's usually about 6 inches down that it's really going to heat it up. And I doubt that the tree in 6 to 8 weeks would like just go down from there, because they typically have a little bit deeper rooted, they have deeper roots. So I kind of think I'm erring on the side that I think the tree would be fine. And especially if you're watering it initially, it's like it has some water to survive off of.
Yeah, it might help because the water doesn't evaporate.
Yeah, it'll be interesting, but I can't I'm not, don't hold me to it legally.
That's okay. No worries.
Kimball, I'm sorry, I didn't see your hand raised, and now I do. Did you have a question or a comment?
Yeah, put the question in the chat also. Is horseweed kind of considered a weed, and should that be removed when you see that plant in your garden?
Horseweed, is that, do you know another common name for it? I'm not familiar with horseweed.
Yeah, starts with
or do you know what it looks like?
Yeah, it's really tall. It goes up to 6 to 8 feet. It's very small.
I mean, typically,
leaves on it.
again, if it's something you don't want there, it's a weed. You know what I mean? That's and maybe what you were asking more is like, is it an invasive weed? Because there are definitely things that are not from, they're not native, and they are very invasive. I'm not familiar with horseweed. You said it's really tall. Does it have yellow flowers, like yellow?
It's got white flowers on it. Fairly tall. It does produce quite a few seeds.
Oh, I see. Okay, yeah. Arthur, you just posted it in there.
Yeah.
Oh, yes. Oh, okay. This is horseweed. Oh,
Yeah.
wow. Mare's tail. Okay, that's okay. This is what I've heard it called mare's tail. I guess that makes sense. Mares. I should have known that. Yeah, that is definitely a weed. What were you asking? So you wanted to know, should it be removed when you plant in?
Yeah,
the
so I know it produces a lot of seeds, unfortunately. Yeah, I don't know if this should be something that should be removed.
Definitely. And I think horseweed particularly would be great for cutting back to the base of the ground. That one, especially if you get it before it starts producing seed, just say when it's in that kind of green vegetative phase, definitely cutting it back. And Brittany, nutgrass definitely is a weed. It's definitely a pain in the ass. Typically, I see nutgrass in the kind of wetter zones, kind of like areas that kind of hold some water, and it can be very problematic. That one I find, I actually pull that one. I know you're not supposed to, but that one I find I like want to get rid of all of it because it kind of has a little bit of the seed. So I can't say I actually practice everything that's preached here myself. So, oh, that's interesting. Netta says the nuts on the root are edible of nutgrass. Okay, so I'm going to keep going because I'll get distracted. I'm going to turn off the chat again, guys. Okay, lastly, there's chemical control for weeds. And these are typically what we would call like the last resort, and a lot of popular herbicides are based in glyphosate, as you guys know. Also probably know it's pretty detrimental to animal life and humans. So we want to avoid them as much as possible, and really just use them in extreme cases. And an extreme case could be something like a crabgrass or a Bermuda grass that's like entangled in the roots or choking out one of your native plants. That would be a situation where you could potentially use a chemical herbicide. But even in that case, not only is it a last resort, but if you are applying it, you definitely want to be very selective about it and precise about application. So even in that case, I would even, like, if you have a glove on, dip that hand in the herbicide and just kind of run your hand along the plant so that you coat the plant being the weed. So you coat the weed with the herbicide and avoid touching anything else. So even with herbicides, I typically wouldn't ever recommend like just spray the whole damn thing. You know what I mean? It would have to be a situation that was very extreme. There are, speaking of spraying the whole thing, there are pre-emergent strategies, pre-emergent herbicides, which kind of kill the seeds or the sprouting seeds or the new seedlings. And people kind of use it. I've seen this used with, like, they call it dead bedding, where you kind of like water, and then you, well, with a pre-emergent herbicide, you always have to water it in. You have to water it in to make it effective. So you actually encourage these seeds to grow and add the pre-emergent herbicide. So you kind of kill the whole seed bed, or weed seed bank. That's the idea. But yeah, again, it works if you're trying to clear like the ground prior to planting. But I would definitely be careful with pre-emergent herbicides, because they usually last about 3 to 4 months, and then they start breaking down and they're not effective anymore. So make sure you're not doing it within the time frame that you want to maybe put out wildflowers or annuals, because it will stop germination of those wildflowers as well. So just being cognizant when you use these chemical ones that they can have other effects. And then I guess this is also a chemical, but not as toxic, but I should definitely mention it, which is like organic botanical oils, or like a vinegar. These kind of herbicides, what we'd call them, they are technically chemical. These are obviously less toxic, and typically they require kind of hot weather and really bright sun to be really effective. So you want to put them on the plant, and you don't want to dilute them like with the pre-emergent herbicide. You water it in, so it's kind of diluting it. But in the case of like a horticultural, like botanical oil or a vinegar, you want it really concentrated. You want that bright ass light and heat to kind of burn the plant. And it works best, these work best with like kind of younger plants or shallow rooted plants. If something's really big and established, it'd be hard. It's harder, much harder to for these vinegars and kind of like horticultural oils to work, or these kind of organic alternatives. So definitely, if it's something that's young, you can get away with, you can do that, and that makes sense. Yeah, and also, because they need that bright light and heat, they typically work better inland. If you're a coastal area, there's a lot of cooler temperatures and a lot more moisture in the air, so they're just a little less effective there. Okay, so natives, these can be weedy also. And like I was saying, weeds are just something you don't want there. So some of our native plants can kind of qualify for being considered a weed if someone if someone just doesn't want them in their garden. And sorry, fixing things up. So they can become invasive too. I think natives become weedy when you haven't chosen the right plant for the right place. So again, it always comes back to right plant for the right location. And something like a Romnea coulterii, like the fried egg poppy, that we all love, that actually spreads by rhizomes. And so it can get out of control. And so if you're not putting it in a place where it's allowed to spread out, then it can definitely become weedy. It can even go under concrete, I know, like sidewalks. So careful with things like that. There's a lot of Eriogonum species that we consider free seeders, which just means that they germinate pretty readily once they drop their seed. And you can see like Eriogonums, which are the buckwheats, a lot of the buckwheats, sprouting in mulch or even DG. Also poppies, you guys know, we saw in some photos earlier in this, course that California poppies sprout up right in DG. I think this says DC pathways, but it meant to say DG. So anyway, a lot of those are going to be considered weeds and you'd have to maintain them. And again, those are pretty easy. A lot of our natives, I wouldn't say Mattia poppy, but a lot of the natives are easy to just kind of cut back with that method of just cutting them back to the ground. Epilobium, this photo on the right is the California fuchsia or epilobium. This is definitely something that spreads by rhizomes and can get weedy and out of control for people. So just being cognizant of that. Oenthera would be the evening primrose, and Cicerentium is the blue-eyed grass. And these also they spread a lot. And so just making sure that you're aware of that before you plant them, because they can get weedy, or just know that they're going to be a regular part of your weeding maintenance. So we're going to talk about IPM. I guess I'll just check to see any questions. Nuts on the roots are edible. Apparently ducks like the nutgrass. Oh yeah. I also have heard this, that nutgrass is a symptom of anaerobic or waterlogged soils, soils that tend to get pretty waterlogged. I've never heard anaerobic, but it would make sense because they can be similar. I've heard of people using boiling water to kill weeds. Done it in the right context. Do you think this method makes sense? I agree. I think that this is a lot like the vinegar ones. Like I think this could make sense for younger younger weeds that don't have really deep roots, or you have to be like really on top of it. I do know some people who've used it with, trying to think of an example, but something like a shallow rooted thing that's very newly establishing weed. But I think it also could kind of get you a head start maybe on something. It might just kind of like cut it back a bit and then you can get in there. But I have personally not had a lot of success with boiling water. But if any of you others have, please let Ernesto know. Yes, blowtorches, I've seen that definitely used for weeds, for burning weeds. Again, in our fire prone area, it's just, you got to make sure you're doing it with someone who knows what they're doing. And and I definitely have seen the blowtorches used more in the farm setting, because typically your farm is getting a lot of consistent moisture because you're growing vegetables or flowers. And so it's a lot less of a risk for fire. Whereas our native plants, especially in the summer, get pretty dry, and that's part of their kind of nature. And so, that's where I would think it's a little more risky. Okay, integrated pest management. We're going to talk about this a little bit, which is IPM for short. We're just going to talk about the different principles. The resources for this, okay, so IPM, I really recommend in your student handbook, or on the outline for this class, you have the website for this, which is you can just Google UC IPM. But if you want to find it, but there's an actual website link in the handout, in the student workbook. I guess it's the same thing. But IPM is essentially an ecosystems-based strategy that's focused on long-term prevention of pests or their damage through a combination of techniques like biological control, habitat manipulation, modifying of cultural practices, or using resistant varieties. It's really kind of thinking about like a more holistic approach to pest management. It's not just like, oh, I have this one pest, I'm applying this chemical. It's trying to see this as a whole habitat that exists, and really wanting to go for the lowest impact or the least toxic solution. So that's what we're talking about with IPM, is these low impact, least toxic, and very much preventative based pest management. So this is important with native plants, because native gardens, one of the big kind of pluses and benefits to them is that they actually support habitat. They actually create ecosystems. So we want to use the least toxic solutions when dealing with pests as much as we can, so that we can kind of keep that that habitat a feature of them. Whereas if we're using chemicals, that kind of defeats the purpose, and you're killing not only whatever pests, but you potentially are risking killing whatever pollinators and other wildlife are coming in. So that's why we use IPM. IPM is developed by the UCs, and well, I don't know if it's developed by them, but it could be. I actually don't know. But I do know that they have a website, which is UC's Integrated Pest Management. Like I said, you can Google UC IPM. This is an awesome website. It's for not just for native plants, it's for agriculture, ornamental plants that you have in your garden, roses, whatever. It's a really great guide to the least toxic IPM treatments for home and garden. And yeah, I can't really recommend it enough. We'll talk about it a little bit more, but the idea is, yeah, trying to use the least toxic thing and, you know, being the least detrimental to beneficial insects and any of the natural predators that exist in our habitat that we've created with the garden. One important concept of IPM is like the threshold or action level. So really, basically it's like, at what point do you actually do something about a pest, and at what threshold do you have to cross for a pest to be something that you actually, you know, do something about? And this is important to really consider, because just seeing, you know, maybe a pest in your garden, but you don't see a lot of damage, maybe you need to reframe how you're thinking about it. You know, do we really need to do something about it if it's not doing a lot of damage? I think also it can be different for different parts of the yard. You know, like maybe your threshold is much higher in the backyard because it's not at the front of your property, and maybe the parkway you want the lowest threshold, or you know, you want to act on the littlest thing because you want it to look, you know, more manicured or something. So it's important to just consider this, because also sometimes if we just leave something and like give it some time, or leave a pest, you actually give time for the natural predators to build up and show up and eat that problem pest or something. So again, like kind of reframing the way you think about this garden, it is a habitat. So sometimes a lot of the pest damage is just evidence that you have a true habitat. So I think it's just an opportunity to think about it differently. Also, something that I know I use with any garden, I definitely started doing this with even vegetable gardens, is kind of thinking about it like a tax. So I kind of would just set like a tax rate that I was okay with, you know, which is like, this is the tax that I pay to nature for letting me be and use her space. And so, you know, maybe it's 10% or maybe it's 25%, but that's my tax. So once the plant has got more than 25% damage, that's when I'm going to start to do something, because that's then over my tax rate. You know what I'm saying? So I kind of tend to think of it that way, which is like, you know, some level that you're okay with having damage, because, you know, it's just a habitat. It's just an insect, you know, it's part of the ecosystem. So, okay, identifying the causes of plant health problems. I think I have to go to a different page of my notes. Yes. So before you actually do something about a pest, you definitely want to make sure you're actually identifying the problem and what's causing it, not just going in for, okay, I see this thing. You definitely want to take into account everything that could be a potential cause. And we kind of categorize this into 4 main categories, which is, could be environmental causes. So, you know, just having, you know, the sun, or like the wrong plant in the sun, that maybe a plant that prefers shade in full sun, that could be a kind of a plant problem that creates a pest or creates some kind of disease condition, but it's really just about the light condition for the plant. So, you know, too much or too little light sometimes really affects the growth of a plant, you know, like the growth rate. You know, if wants more sun, then it's going to be stunted in the shade. Clearly weather has an impact on plants. And it could just be changes in the season, you know, like seasonal changes sometimes means like you could have a migrating pest. I know with agricultural stuff, Bagrata, which is a pest that goes after brassicas, which also goes after bladder pod, but it just shows up in the summer. So if you can hold out for, you know, a couple more months, then maybe you don't have to do anything about it, or just knowing that it's a seasonal thing. Even, you know, storm patterns, droughts, obviously that's something that can cause problems in your plants. And extraordinary events in the weather that can be like heat waves or cold snaps or Santa Ana conditions. Oh yeah, who was it? You should share in the chat. There's like a Twitter feed for Santa Ana wind conditions, which is very cool. I didn't know about that. But anyway, you could follow them and know when the next Santa Anas are coming. Anyway, those would be considered extraordinary weather events, or unfortunately, as climate crisis kind of gets worse, we're going to be vacillating between more extreme weather. So I think this will be more of an issue with our plants. I mean, with all of us, not just the plants, but next, there is cultural causes that create plant problems. Cultural would be humans creating problematic conditions for plants. So this can be like use and abuse, like high traffic areas, or even like some people, like an oak tree, parking right under the oak tree, especially if it's not, on like the dirt around it. The roots don't want to be compacted like that. So that could be, the plant could be suffering from just your own traffic and use of the space around the plant, or whatnot. On-site, off-site issues. Yes, this could be your neighbor potentially has a lawn that they water 3 times a week, and that affects, the plants that are on the edge there. So that can be something that happens. Also, if you just, whatever, I could come up with a bunch of examples, but generally speaking, I would say cultural causes is overwatering. It's just it's most of the time overwatering. That's one of the biggest kind of reasons native plants fail. So that would be a cultural cause, overwatering for sure, because that's something we're doing. Pests are a third cause. So that's kind of what like most of this lecture will be on. But obviously we have different types of pests. There's vertebrate, there's invertebrate, gophers and squirrels and those types, deer, those are going to be what's eating your plants. And then there's things like invertebrates, like the snails and caterpillars and moths and things like that. So categorizing them, okay, this is actually a pest. This isn't a cultural cause. And then lastly, there's disease. So disease is usually, it's a huge category, and it's usually just something that's viral, bacterial, or fungal, usually. And all living plant material, all living material essentially, but all living plant material is susceptible to disease. That's part of nature. And really, we just want to avoid creating the conditions that increase their susceptibility to disease. And that would be caused, by stressing the plant or compromising its immune system in some way. And that can be done by our practices. If we're overwatering or choosing the wrong place for the plant, that's going to potentially compromise the plant's immune system and then make it more susceptible to disease. So, we want to do as much as we can to keep our plants healthy using best practices. And then there is a note about kind of symptoms versus disease, which is, you can have the same symptom present with different diseases. And I think this is really easy to understand, especially since we're in the middle of a pandemic still, which is, the disease itself that has caused a pandemic is one thing. But the symptoms could, you could have a fever and maybe have COVID, or you could have a fever and have some other disease, or have some other bacterial infection, something else. So just because you've noted a symptom doesn't mean you know what the disease is. So you do have to make sure you're actually getting down to like, what is the disease being caused by? Is it viral, fungal? Is it even a disease? That's a really important kind of distinction. And that's because sometimes the symptom and I guess I'll get into that in the next slide. But yeah, so the symptom is just something that is like a visibly present on the plant usually. And you have to get down to what it actually is. I'm just seeing if there's anything. Okay, I think I have a plant pathology. Yes, okay. This is a plant pathology triangle. This is essentially helping you to see that you need all 3 factors for disease to actually develop. So you need a susceptible host, you need a pathogen, and you need favorable conditions. Favorable spelled the English way. You need a favorable environment for that pathogen. So you need all 3 of these. And if you just have 2, that doesn't mean you're going to have disease. So that's an important thing to keep in mind, that we can, we have some power here, right? So I think a good example would be Armillaria root rot. It's called oak root fungus is the common name of it. It's a fungus, and it affects coast live oak. It affects Catalina ironwood. and it's a fungus. So it would be the pathogen. The host would be, say, the coast live oak. And typically it's overwatering or watering at the base of the tree, like right at the trunk, that causes this fungus to proliferate. So if you had, you can use the triangle to see that. If, maybe I have a coast live oak and I'm overwatering it, but if there's none of that fungus present, then I don't have to worry about getting that disease. Or if maybe I have the oak root fungus in my soil, and I'm definitely overwatering it, or there's waterlogged soils, but I have no coast live oak or susceptible plant to that pathogen, then I don't have to worry about it because there's not going to create a disease if there's no host for it. And then lastly, with the last combination, it's like you could have the oak and have the pathogen present in your soil. Like you could have the fungus and you have an oak tree there, but you make sure not to water in the summer. You don't waterlog the soils, and the pathogen just never proliferates, and you never see a disease breakout. So yeah, that's just an important thing to remember, that it's not about like sterilizing your soil to get rid of every pathogen. It's about creating the conditions where the pathogens don't thrive. And that is a lot of part of that soil ecology that we talked about. Just quickly, I kind of want to go through this, which is, this is more important when you're actually using the UC IPM website, that you really take into account describing the plant health problem thoroughly. So if you see something on the leaf, don't just be like, okay, it's a leaf, and like run off with the leaf. Make sure to go through it methodically when investigating whatever damage. So start with the whole plant, which means like, yes, look at the whole plant in its entirety, but also like, what life cycle is it in? Is this a new plant? Is this a germinating plant? Is this an establishing or mature plant? Like take that into account the first, and then move down to like the main stems and trunks and branches. Is this like localized on, just the branches? Or am I seeing dieback on my Arctostaphylos? That can happen with, on the main stem. Or is there like some kind of resin seeping out of the bark? That sort of thing. Like look at the main stem part. Then go to the foliage, which is the leaves, and describe anything that's happening. Is there like, are the leaves deformed in any way? Are they, a different color? Is there some kind of powdery substance on them? Do my mallows have leaf minor? Are there galls? You see oak galls on oak trees. You also see them galls on manzanitas. Just that might be something that you just see on the leaves. And then you move to flowers, which could just be, are the flowers like appearing normal? Are they blooming in regular quantities at the expected time of year? Are they deformed? Etc. And then lastly, fruit. So most of our natives don't have like an obvious fruit on them, but if they do, you just kind of basically ask yourself: is the fruiting pattern normal? Is the fruiting pattern normal? Is the fruit misshapen? Just asking yourself all those questions. Just a really important and good habit to get into. Okay, IPM solutions. So once you've kind of described your problem and you've looked it up and researched like what's wrong with it, and you have a solution that you want to use, you've looked it up, then you think about, okay, what kind of solution do I use? And again, we want to use with IPM the lowest or the least toxic kind of solutions. They kind of break them up into 4 different categories, similar to the weeding categories we were talking about. But there's biological controls for for pests. And this would be using any kind of natural enemies like predators, or, you can buy a lot of these beneficial predatory insects at like different agricultural stores to kind of deal with pest populations. But it can be lots of different things. It can be pathogens, parasites. They have like a fermented bacterium that you can use, or something like BT is a biological control. But yeah, so that would be one category. Something like ladybugs on aphids, like this picture shows, and that's just a biological control. Cultural controls. This is the same. This would be changing your practices to control or reduce like a pest establishing or surviving or reproducing. So this would be, changing your irrigation practices potentially, or maybe decreasing your watering or decreasing your watering in summer, or maybe changing your watering pattern, so you do deep waterings and maybe not the like frequent but shallow ones. These are kind of, things that you would be doing to change, you do physically, as a human, you do that to alter the pest pest-like prevalence. That could also be, it doesn't have to be watering, it could also be like doing a more open planting layout, like allowing for more airflow so that it's not so crowded, which also can create conditions for certain diseases. Third IPM solution would be a mechanical or physical control. And this is just something, physically or, physically controlling or blocking some kind of pest, or somehow making the environment not suitable for it in some mechanical or physical way. I mean, I typically, with this, I just think of like kind of gopher traps. Any kind of trap is going to be that, but also it could be, I guess, like a gopher basket if you plant in gopher baskets, something like that. That would be a physical control. And then lastly, of course, last resort is the chemical control. And again, just like with herbicides, you want to be very selective about when you use a pesticide, and also when you're using it, making sure that if you do get to use it to this level of like, I need to use a pesticide, you want to combine it with other approaches or other types of control, like also combine it with a mechanical control. And that's going to be more effective long-term kind of long-term solution for your problem. So don't go straight to it, and make sure to do like multi-pronged approach here. And if you are using like a bait or something like that, or a toxin, using it in like a bait station, and rather than spraying it everywhere, that's preferred. Just trying to keep any kind of toxic or poisonous thing kind of more localized. Okay, we're going to talk about pests and conditions. Let's take a break and get back at 604. There's so many slides, so I want to get through them. So we'll take a break, time out, and 604 will continue with the actual pests and conditions. I'm going to check out your guys' chat. Nice. Yeah, Milton, that was a great example. Like eventually aphids just kind of show up. I'm sorry, ladybugs show up for aphids. Yeah, BT is very helpful for any of those kind of caterpillar worm type deals. Yeah, hand squishing, man. I'm still a fan of, if you can, get in there and squish some.
Yeah, I also use the diatomaceous earth, which is pretty good also.
Yes, I'm so glad you mentioned that, because I remember the last time I did this lecture, I never mentioned it. But yes, diatomaceous earth is great for a lot of those invertebrate type species, so like anything that's kind of a creepy crawlier type thing, it essentially like dries them out, because that's how it works. So yeah, diatomaceous earth can be really helpful. Thank you for mentioning it. I know I'm going to mention something that I use diatomaceous earth for, but I can't remember which one it is. Yes, a lot of the, good point, Netta, a lot of the actually diatomaceous earth and even like BT, which is Bacillus thuringiensis or something, and it's used for caterpillars and things like that. It'll have an impact on other beneficials too. So it's about timing with those ones too, making sure that, it's not correlating with, that when pollinators are out or something like that, or making sure that, again, you're applying it in a way where you're avoiding the least damage to everyone else in the plant community or bug community. Okay. what did I say? 604? Yeah, I said 604. Milton, are you asking if diatomaceous earth or BT is caterpillar safe? BT is definitely not.
Diatomaceous earth.
I believe it's I thought I'm under the impression that it only is like the kind of like roly-polies and things that kind of like walk over it, but I can imagine that I'm not really sure actually.
Because if I use it, my milkweed gets a lot of aphids. And I can't use anything because I use it as a monarch
Yeah,
like habitat.
for sure.
But right now, I don't think there's any caterpillars on it anymore. I'd have to double check because I think we're out of season for it.
Yeah.
There was this, but then the question would be, let's say if I use it when I don't see any more caterpillars. Oh, but this plant also died, is like the diatomaceous earth going to be in the soil come next spring, or kind of?
Usually it kind of breaks down with water, the diatomaceous earth. So it's not really as effective once it's like in the soil and been watered, and diluted and whatnot. That being said, though, the milkweeds attract aphids and actually then attract a lot of beneficial insects. So you would really want to be like almost leaving those aphids on, because like the milkweed is a particularly like attractive for aphids. So that's kind of part of them. And then they actually attract a lot of beneficial insects. So I would encourage you just to like let those aphids at the milkweed. Netta says the milkweed aphids are only specific to the milkweeds, and apparently they're a food source for cats. Cats? Really? Wow. I've never seen, caterpillars. I was like, okay, wow, of course. I just like imagined a cat doing that thing where they eat cat grass. Yes, yeah. No, this is exactly, thank you, Netta. You said it so much more concisely, which is the milkweed aphids are specific to milkweeds. They actually attract the beneficials, and yeah, they actually become a food source for the caterpillars. It's like part of the whole cycle. The milkweeds has got that nice little cycle in it.
I don't know.
I have a question too afterward.
Yeah, I don't know who's speaking.
This is Carolina
Oh,
speaking.
Carolina, okay.
Sorry.
Go ahead.
Oh, sorry. I was reading in the workbook. This is a term that I don't know what it stands for, REI, and it's talking about herbicides.
Yes, that's a re-entry interval. It's basically like the time at which you are allowed to kind of go into an area after you've sprayed. And usually, I think what they talk about in there is the REI is typically like 4 hours or something for pre-emergent herbicides. Yeah. And in that case, that would be something like you don't want your dogs and pets and stuff running around in that interval time or before that interval time, if that makes sense.
Yeah, so read
I think it's called re-entry interval. So
yeah.
it's like at what point can you re-enter, like the time you have to wait before you can re-enter into the space, that
so
you
basically
sprayed.
read the label and see how much time it is.
Yes,
Thank
definitely.
you.
Yeah, thank you for mentioning that. That's also in my notes, but I forgot about that. But yeah, definitely you want to be just being very, if anytime you're going to use a chemical solution for something, make sure you're like really reading it, like just not only for the re-entry interval, but like I was saying, a lot of them break down. If the pre-emergent herbicides, it takes 3 to 4 months to break down, and they'll usually say something about how long it takes to break down. I think they have another kind of jargon term for that. I can't remember right now at the top of my head. But again, if it's going to be like this pre-emergent herbicide lasts in your soil for 6 months, you got to make sure you're applying it 6 months before you want to germinate anything. If you are germinating anything, it's not going to affect your plants that are in the ground, because a pre-emergent herbicide is specifically attacking seedlings and seeds. But if you were going to plant wildflowers or something, or any kind of seeds, then you would be want to be cognizant of that. I'm gonna keep going with the lecture. There's a lot of slides now, guys. I'm sorry. I will just to kind of warn you now, I'll be talking at you, and hopefully I'll leave some time for, I want to get to actually looking at the UC IPM websites for those of you that aren't familiar. But vertebrates are, so we're going to start with pests and conditions and kind of go from like big vertebrates down to small water molds. So vertebrates in terms of pests, actual pests that you see, I think the most common one is gophers. That's the one I hear about the most, see the most. This slide was designed by California Native Plant Society, so there's some real anti-cat vibe in here. But personally, and I understand, because I think I want to warn people about outdoor cats, because they can predate on lizards and birds, and those are really important to the habitat itself. They actually keep a lot of our pests in control, a lot of our pest populations. So I understand wanting to keep our outdoor cats from predating on them. However, that being said, so if you got a good hunting cat that can get gophers, I don't know, it's kind of a trade-off, because gophers can be so problematic. They tend to like a taproot. So if you've ever pulled up a California poppy, you can see it has like a little carrot kind of root. That's a taproot, like a long long root like that. That's like a carrot. That's considered a taproot. Also, Sphaerulaceae ambigua, which is the apricot mallow, that has a taproot. So they prefer those, but gophers have preferences, but that doesn't mean they won't eat something else if there's nothing else around. You know what I mean? So I've seen them eat all sorts of things. There are some plants that they say are a little bit like better at not necessarily deterrence for a gopher, but they're less likely to eat. And that might be something like yerba mansa, Artemisia californica, a lot of the ground cover manzanitas, coyote bush, that one sometimes. There's sometimes salvia or yarrows, but again, like I said, I know they do eat those other things in a pinch, or maybe their tunnels kind of create havoc and destroy some of those other plants. So they can be really problematic. I recommend this cinch trap, which is the picture in the bottom right, or maybe the Victor trap. It's kind of the best case scenario for gophers traps, I think, personally. You guys, my hidden talent like in life, sadly, is catching gophers. It's like, so I really have a lot of success with it. I know not everyone does, but like, not to brag. That's where I have success. So I don't really have a lot of experience using other things, and I've never really found the gopher baskets very helpful. But I mean, if you guys use them and like them, great. But I tend to feel like they're going to, the gopher baskets that people plant into will like disturb the roots quite a bit, and kind of, I don't know, it's not my ideal. So I use traps, but otherwise, yeah, cats or skunks and possums and raccoons, this is something that either, you make sure you just, close your trash cans or something like that. So these are kind of our more vertebrate pests. Obviously there's deers and squirrel and things like that. But again, if you have a problem pest like squirrels and deer, you try to not plant plants that they like. Whereas gophers are pretty a generalist in terms of plant eating. Insects obviously are a type of pest that you can have, and insects though can also be part of the wildlife, as we've kind of talked about. A perfect example of kind of an insect that is definitely part of the wildlife, because, well, I should say, like, insects they're also considered pollinators. So when we say pollinators, we're not just talking about butterflies. It's also like the native wasps and the flies and all the other things that also can pollinate, and moths, things like that. Those are all categorized under insects. And the leafcutter bee is a great example, which is this solitary, non-stinging, soil-dwelling native bee that is a really great spreader of pollen. Like the pollen doesn't stick very tightly to them, so they are considered really good pollen spreaders, whereas a European honeybee actually is a great pollen collector because the pollen sticks to it really well, but not as good at pollinating other things like spreading the pollen. So the leafcutter bee, what it does is it cuts out these cute little like formations, these little shapes out of a leaf, and they line their soil tunnels, and place their larval eggs or their larvae in there. and actually cover them, like, layer them between little leaf pieces. So them cutting all these little pieces out is really just like this bee doing her thing. She's just doing what she does, and she's just evidence that your habitat is actually occupied by a lot of different native wildlife, which would be also including the leafcutter bee. So it's kind of an opportunity sometimes, the insects, to talk about pollinators. And it's definitely something you want to make sure you don't just, if you see damage, think like, oh, I got to kill this. Because sometimes it's a sign of something that's really cool about your native plant garden. And sometimes that damage, in quotes, is evidence that you actually have a habitat dweller in your garden, which is kind of cool. Another thing, which is like the aphids, like I know this is more of a vegetable example, but I know I had a really old kale plant that I kind of left to go, and I was kind of harvesting on it, kind of not. And it started to get a bunch of aphids on it, when it started to warm up. And I just kind of left it there. And then sure enough, the population of aphids kind of started to accumulate. And then you're basically creating its own, food source for other predators. And then sure enough, I think after like a month or something, I can't remember how much time I left it, because I'm kind of a lazy gardener at home. And every day I would, like in the afternoon, I would see a whole flock of bush tits that would come and just clean up that whole kale plant. So this can happen in your garden too, especially with like buildup of population. If you let the population build up, a lot of times the natural predators will just show up because you're actually creating food for somebody else. So insects can be food for other insects or other wildlife. So not always a bad thing. One that's kind of a bad thing would be Argentine ants. Argentine ants are an invasive species. They are not a native ant. They actually create these like mega colonies that are like counties big. They're huge colonies of the same colony of these ants. And there's actually a podcast on Argentine ants that's really fascinating, that they're basically warring with the California native harvester ant. And they kind of war for space. But this one is invasive. And what it does a lot of times is it actually farms scale or aphids. And this picture is a ant with a scale. And the scale and aphids are sucking the sap out of the plant. And they actually kind of excrete like a sugary substance, which is basically their poop. But the ants are hanging around farming them for that sugary exudate. So they actually farm these very effectively and protect this like basically agricultural crop for them. And so they can be really problematic. They'll even like go after like a honeybees that are trying to pollinate. They'll like go after them. Ladybugs that come to eat the aphids, they'll attack them. So they're very effective at that. But not only that, is that they're basically protecting a pest so that it starts to decimate the plant. And on top of it, they like to usually place them also around the roots sometimes of the plant, like the base of the plant. And you'll see sometimes like little scales at the base of the plant, but almost look like bark or little bumps that are hard to identify. But also they'll place it along the roots of the plant, the kind of shallow roots. And in doing so, they're removing a bunch of soil. So your plant starts to actually not only get like sucked its life force out of it, but also it is almost kind of experiencing more drought conditions because there's less soil. So it's actually looser in the soil and more aerated in a bad way. So they can be very problematic. And if you're not sure if you have them, these look for like a lot of tiny little black, brown, non-biting ants. They don't bite. These aren't like those fire ants that you see in your kitchen or something in the trash. These guys there'd be a lot of them, and they might be very active and aggressive, but they don't bite typically. And you can look for those little bumpy scales around the base of a plant if you are seeing that. And the scale or aphids could be white, gray, brown, orange. They come in all sorts of colors. But the ants also sometimes, I actually didn't know this till I started teaching this course, that they actually, they eat the small fleshy like seed attachments to things like purslane, veld grass, spurge, and chickweed. So if you see a lot of those weeds around, you have the ants and all the other kind of hints, you might really suspect you have Argentine ants. And that's actually what helped me determine that I had those by my house. And I was like, oh, because that weed always came back. And the problem is So they're not only, farming the scale that's killing the plant, but they're also spreading weed seeds everywhere that you don't want. So they're very difficult to control once they're established. But typically you want to use like, what's it called? There is like baits that they have for it, and like pyrethrin based kind of lines that can kill them. But with baits, you again want to do like slow acting baits. They actually take it back to their nest. There is something called Nematode, which is like a beneficial nematode that I'm not sure like how it does it, but it's a beneficial nematode that actually takes out ant queens. So that is also potentially a useful thing. But essentially, yeah, bait, and you can bait them. And the other thing is you want to deal with the actual aphid infestation or the scales. So you want to deal with their crop too that they're farming. So aphids, I think, is the next slide. So I can talk about what you do with aphids. So again, ants can harvest and keep their aphids, farmed. And like in this picture is the ant with all the aphids. But also, as you probably have all seen, aphids also exist without the Argentine ant harvesting it. So they can be problematic in either situation. They are sucking the sap out of the plant. You can see them on all sorts of plants. And typically they go after like the young, fleshy new growth of a plant. And that's why you want to avoid using nitrogen high fertilizers, because nitrogen stimulates that fresh new growth. So a lot of times when you're over fertilizing, you get a lot of aphids because you're just basically creating the conditions, and that's just a niche that they can fill. So with the aphids though, just like, the least toxic thing is just like a strong jet with the hose. That'll just knock them all off. And they're usually not hardy enough to like climb back up. They're like basically like, blasted off and dead. And then I like to follow it up, do it with an insecticidal soap, or just like a mild dish soap type of thing in water. And I usually like to like make sure I get it all in there, not just spray, but like make sure I get my hands and coat wherever the aphids are. And that'll actually dry out their kind of soft bodies. And with these type of approaches, like a water hose or the soaps, the insecticidal soaps, you kind of need to follow up sort of frequently, especially if you have a larger infestation. So like, weekly, and then maybe taper off. So there's also clearly you can do like ladybugs, you can buy those as beneficial insects, but I tend to see that you got to have an aphid infestation to keep ladybugs around. They need a whole buffet. Otherwise they're just going to go to where there's more food. So it might seem like a lot of aphids to you, but if the ladybug doesn't agree, it's not going to stay. So I like I said, I use the soaps usually. And then again, like we kind of mentioned in the chat during the break, sometimes also letting the population build up can lead to beneficial insects or other predators that show up. So like I said, ladybugs, they need a lot of food. And if it's really not killing the plant, sometimes it's worth letting it go to see if something will, the next season, something else shows up or something like that. Then there is scale, which is, again, can be farmed by ants, but also can just exist naturally on its own. And they look like these kind of bumpy, hard-shelled insects. They're pretty much like stationary, the adults are. The young are more soft-bodied and mobile. And they're pretty hard to remove, but typically you can use an insecticidal soap with them as well, but you kind of have to break their shells first. And you can do that with like a toothbrush or your fingernail or like a stick or kind of like a sandpapery kind of thing to just kind of break up the shell a bit so that the soap that you use will actually kind of like get in there. What did I want to say? Typically you want to apply it when they're dormant or kind of recently active. So that's usually like late winter to early spring. But yeah, I guess that's all I really want to say about scale. Oh my God, I didn't realize there's an ant on this picture right there. Oh, okay. Thrips, that's thrips you tend to see. Okay, so this picture seems like just so impossible. This is the thrip here. He has like two little antennae. They're kind of long and slender, usually kind of like pale blackish color, maybe a dark brown. They are usually short, like have these short little antennae, and yeah, they have these sucking mouth parts that that create this effect here that you see, this like silvery, coppery stippling that happens, and they're basically sucking sap out of the plant. They're found on the underside of the leaf. They're always found on the underside. And also you'll probably see some of this black sticky stuff that's their frass, which is their poop. So there's a lot of different things that can create this kind of stippling effect. So you want to make sure you actually see the thrip and maybe their poop to actually confirm that you have thrips. But typically they're pretty tolerable in the landscape, and you can just prune out whatever ugly kind of thing that you don't like, but they typically don't like take out a whole plant. They're just not that aesthetically pleasing. So really, yeah, you can prune it out, or you can also kind of do like a jet of water, because really they are on the underside of the leaf. And if you blast them out from under there with a lot of movement to the underside of the leaf, you pretty much knock them off. And if you do that regularly enough during their like active period, it usually kind of takes care of them and they don't really get out of control. So yeah, so you can use the soaps also if you want to spray a soap to try to get rid of them, but you really have to have like a real infestation. And like I said, it's not usually really problematic. Oops. Okay, then there's mealybug, which is, oh, Milton, you're sharing your aphids. I see. Yeah, see, that's one. And it looks like there's like the sooty mold that kind of forms, the black that you see around. A lot of times happens when you have a lot of aphids because of that sugary excretion they create. And then the sooty mold starts happening, which is kind of like the right conditions. What was that?
That might be because I my hand popping them and I don't wash off the sugary.
Yeah, like I'd recommend it only because that sugary exudate can be kind of like food for some fungal thing. But yeah, I mean, that's exactly what it looks like. So thank you for sharing. Okay, mealybugs. I personally, I don't know why, I have a very high tolerance for being grossed out. And for some reason, mealybugs do it for me. They are, I don't know. The thing is this picture here, it almost looks like a roly-poly. They are kind of individually this like oval insect that have a bunch of legs, and they kind of have this waxy kind of white secretion that's all over them. But they're kind of like mealy, cottony. But what grosses me out is not the individual. You typically kind of find them in like masses. And this leaf on the right kind of shows it, but like you can find them even more so. And they're typically, you kind of find them in like little nooks and crannies, but it says looks like slender snowflakes, but I would very much disagree. I feel like it looks like this cottony, nasty, mealy thing. I don't know why it's so gross to me. But that being said, yeah, you typically see them kind of in a larger mass because it's multiple individuals and it's not just the one kind of guy. With these, usually soap or alcohol can kind of kill it. You can wipe it down with that. And you just want to make sure that you actually get in there, because a lot of times they're kind of nooked in so that you're actually, they're actually, the alcohol or the soap is actually touching their body or their the outside of them. I want to see if I have anything else about that. Yes. Also, this is a cultural practice thing. You want to make sure that you're, it's the right plant for the right place, and watering, not overwatering with these kind of guys, or sometimes overhead watering, not always, but they are kind of sensitive to heat. So I typically, don't see them in the summer, but I'm trying to think if I've had an example of that. But anyway, they gross me out, and you should use insecticidal soap or like some kind of alcohol. Oh, I was going to say on this last slide, the thrips. Sometimes what looks like this also would be like spider mites. They actually kind of make a similar sort of look on the leaf, not so much, but a little bit, like it looks kind of messy with the black frass and stuff, but you would see some webbing from the little spider mites. So that would be how you tell the difference. I just want to make it clear, because thrips kind of can be confused with a couple different things. And with the spider mites, you would use something like, you always want to remove the webbing and then apply like a soap or alcohol or something like that. But getting rid of the webbing is a big part of it. Okay, So bark beetles, okay, how much time do I have? Oh, I gotta get through this. Okay, bark beetles are, there are so many. I think beetles in general are like a quarter of all the species of like, what's it called, of animals on the planet. So there are tons of types of bark beetles, so I can't go into every single one. But generally speaking, they're very small. You can see this is the end of a matchstick. So they're small, kind of cylindrical bodied guys, and they bore into the bark, usually like make a little hole, very small hole. And then if you peel back the bark, like this photo on the right, you can actually see the tunnels they create. So you might see the small holes on this bark surface, you might not. And then but if you remove the bark, you'll see they're tunneling, and they I guess are getting more out of control with climate change. But there are so many different types, and on the website, the UCA IPN website, they actually have a chart by beetle, like the species of beetle and what kind of damage it creates. I think they have a photo. So you can actually peel back the bark to reveal the tunnel and kind of try to identify that way. But that being said, I think the bark beetles that I think are the most concerned is, I don't have a slide for this one, but the gold spotted oak borer, which is a decimating oaks in Southern California. You can Google it. That is problematic for sure. And I know that's one that is an exotic species. And then also this one, which is the invasive shot-hole borer. And this one is most problematic because this is a non-native thing that was introduced, I think, I can't remember when. I think it was introduced on, anyway, it's introduced species that the problem with it is not just that they bore in the bark, but many times they carry disease in their mouth parts. So this one particularly carries the Fusarium dieback in its mouth parts, which this is like a fungal pathogen. And what the pathogen does is it actually stops water movement in the plant. And so that ends up leading to dieback in the plant and eventually death for the plant. So there aren't a whole lot of things you can do with any kind of bark beetle or borer, but what you can do if you see like evidence of it, well, first of all, this would be the evidence of the invasive shot-hole borer. So again, there's the staining here. You can see they're gumming potentially. So there's like resin that comes out. Here's the tunnels. And then the sugary exudate, the sugar volcano, they call it. And then lastly, the frass. So if you're seeing any of this evidence, I would freak out and then make a decision to prune this out. So if it's just affecting one limb, you definitely want to prune it out. And then you want to destroy that, whatever you've pruned on site. Don't move it around LA County so that this potential problem thing can spread all over, because it is problematic. And that's actually, I think, the gold spotted oak borer was like in firewood that came from Arizona, I think is how it got to California. And so A, don't travel with firewood, and B, don't if you prune any of this out, or even if you see a whole tree that's infected, you need to destroy the tree essentially. You want to cut it back and then chip it, on site, or burn it. But you have to kind of deal with it in this extreme measure because this is a very invasive guy, and it's really affecting our oak populations. Or actually, sorry, the gold spotted oak borer is, but the invasive shot-hole borer is currently really more affecting like our box elders, California sycamore, Torrey pine. They found them here with Torrey pines, coast live oak. It affects, and then even like Palo Verdes. So it's there. The key with these guys is there's not really like anything you can spray for. Again, like I said, it's mostly pruning it out and then destroying whatever you've pruned, and making sure you don't leave that newly fresh cut wood where there's like old wood, especially like an old growth forest, and destroying it as best you can. Even I would suggest solarizing it if you can't chip it, or even if you do chip it maybe. But you can solarize those wood chunks, those what am I thinking of? Oh, logs. I was like, stumps, logs. So yeah, you want to be kind of take extreme measures with these guys because they are so problematic and can really destroy our like Southern California oaks. So that's what I would do with these guys. Was there something else I was going to say about this? Oh, the watering. So these typically are these bark beetles typically, I mean, they're still doing a lot of research on it, but you want to try to keep your oaks as healthy as possible, because it seems almost like they go after well-watered trees, but also any tree that is weaker is going to be susceptible to any disease or insect. You know, they can kind of, there's all sorts of research now that shows that, you know, our pests actually pick up on weaker trees. So avoiding summer watering your oaks, for example, and making sure you're not watering right at the trunk. So definitely trying to keep your trees as healthy as possible to avoid getting bark beetles and shot hole borers and things. Rust is like a catch-all term that's referring to a really large group of different fungi. And typically rusts are kind of host specific. So they're kind of specific to the plant they're on. And usually you kind of see them on more broad-leafed plants. But it can come in all sorts of colors and textures. They could be dry or gelatinous or orange, yellow, red, even gray and black. So this is a big category, but typically rusts, because they are a fungal thing, they have their spores, they need moisture to germinate. So you want to avoid wetting the leaves, especially like leaving the wet leaves overnight. And I know we've talked about watering in the morning or the evening, but if you have a rust issue, then I would say water in the, you know, morning, because then it has time to dry well, you know, dry out during the day. And you're not leaving moisture on the leaves of a plant that is susceptible or already has rust issues. So it's very much kind of preventative. I know an example with native plants would be the cedar apple rust. It actually if you find it on juniper, and then it actually jumps to toyons and goes back to juniper, they go back and forth. So that's one that is host specific to the tube. And usually you can use sulfur powder for rusts. Sulfur is pretty effective with fungal stuff, and but the sulfur is only going to kind of stop it where it's at or potentially prevent it. But if you already have rust, it's not going to like go in reverse and make it go away. Like it doesn't remove the rust that you already have. It just kind of stops it where it is. Sometimes defoliating can help. So removing the leaves that have rust can help, because you're removing the spores that will potentially, you know, spread out to other leaves. But yeah, trying to find a way to kind of break the reproduction cycle. And then lastly, I think I have, yes, waterborne diseases. Waterborne diseases are more like water molds. Phytophthora is one. Water molds are not, I think they used to think it was more fungal, but it's actually now, I think it's closer to like an algae, like a brown algae, but they call it a water mold. And Phytophthora is one that is very commonly referred to. There's a lot of different types of Phytophthora, but that's the genus. And typically Phytophthora is causing crown and root rot on plants. And it always favors wet conditions and poor drainage. So they really like waterlogged soils. And that makes sense because they are water molds. So they actually spread in those conditions. They can proliferate in those conditions of wet, soggy soil. So they, when those conditions are right and you have ripe and you have Phytophthora and you have susceptible plant, like you're kind of setting it up for a disease, Phytophthora, like root rots and crown rots. They do find this. So there is Phytophoras that affect oaks and things, but typically those are in Northern California. What we see Phytophthora mostly in our area is a problem in in like nursery settings. And so nurseries are very cognizant of this, because you can get Phytophthora in your soil from the nursery. They clearly, you want to buy your plants from a reputable nursery and try to avoid that. But essentially, you can avoid it by making sure not to overwater or create waterlogged conditions if you potentially do have Phytophthora in your soil. Powdery mildew. Oh, I forgot I had this one. Powdery mildew is another kind of catch-all term for a large group of fungi that grow this white powdery substance on the leaf surface, and even the stems and sometimes the flower buds. But this one is kind of interesting. Like the other one, you don't want water on the surface of the leaf. Powdery mildew is actually kind of favors like low light conditions. So not necessarily like full shade, but just like almost like I'm thinking like springtime, kind of lower lighting conditions, and they actually proliferate in warm, dry conditions. So not hot, 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 but just warm, dry conditions. That's ripe for powdery mildew. And they kind of like, if there's water on the leaf, it actually kind of inhibits the growth. So it is different than the rust or something like that. So you want to give them full sun. Don't fertilize. That can add to powdery mildew. You can actually wash it off in the mid-morning, spray it off. It's not going to blast off, but it helps to prevent new growth. You can do sulfur also in this case. It is a fungal thing, so sulfur can be useful. I've noticed this a lot with drought stressed plants. So plants that are not getting the appropriate watering, or a lot of shallow watering. So they are kind of drought stressed because they're not getting that deep watering, and they're just kind of like sucking a little bit out of the straw at a time. So I tend to see powdery mildew in those situations, drought stressed plants, but also warm, dry conditions, kind of lower light. And what else is there? Oh, also they talk about having good airflow with powdery mildew, like making sure that you don't have a bunch of plants crammed together. It's kind of like they have high relative humidity around them, even though it's dry conditions outside. But if they're all crowded together, that can also add to powdery mildew conditions. So making sure you have good air circulation. It's kind of hard to control this with pesticides. So really, it's more effective to just do kind of cultural things like changing your practices, or allowing more airflow, or just being preventative in general. Okay, so that's mostly the pests, the kind of more common pests. Obviously, this isn't like an exhaustive list. There are so many pests. And more importantly, I think I want you guys to be familiar with the website, because then you can look it up yourself. But just quickly, I guess I'll go through this. This is in your outline, but IPM programs is basically just using all the practices and principles that we've talked about to create an actual program, which is just a jargon for like, what's your plan? And make sure you have a plan, and that your plan always has like these kind of 6 components, which is like pest identification. Make sure you can actually identify whatever the pest is, because in some cases you'll realize it's not a pest at all. In other times you'll be like, okay, this is a pest. So make sure you include actually pest identification, assessing pest numbers and damage. This kind of gets back to that threshold thing. Make sure you're actually checking your plants regularly to assess, like, is this damage getting out of control? Is it going beyond the kind of tax rate that I'm okay with? Is it possible that if I let this go, this wasn't going to destroy the plant, and that this will attract some beneficial predator that's going to take care of it? And then there's guidelines for when management is needed. So again, you kind of wait, make sure you're assessing your numbers, and when you do act, you should be slow to act. It shouldn't be like, that's part of the threshold thing. And noting if there's any kind of combination of plants that you see that kind of helps control certain insects, like sometimes having a lot of buckwheats, which attract a lot of pollinators and also beneficial insects that are usually predatory, like wasps and things. Those buckwheats can actually kind of attract these parasitic wasps that then parasitize all the pests and things that you might have in your garden. So sometimes like, oh wow, when I have a lot of these, red flowering buckwheat, I don't really have the problem with X pest, so definitely taking notes of that. And then actually this is that note that Netta mentioned in the chat, right? I think Netta mentioned it, but essentially was the milkweed attracts an aphid, and the caterpillars eat that and the foliage. And that's how it works. Like, that's expected with the milkweed. So making sure that you note when it's just kind of part of the nature cycle. And then there is lastly, preventing pest problems in the first place. So taking steps before you even have an issue. And a lot of times you can do that by spacing your plants appropriately and having mulch in between there. That's all kind of preventative stuff. And then using a combination of management tools. So never just relying on one singular tool. So don't just rely on the chemical, don't just rely on this. Always want this like multi-pronged approach. And then lastly, the 6th thing would be assessing the effect of your pest management. So you always want to make sure you actually notice what's happened after you applied your solution or implemented your integrated pest management solution, and take into account all the things that it's affecting. So is it decreasing the infestation or the problem that you originally were concerned about? Or is it affecting anything else? Like, do you also see there's no more frogs and lizards in your garden or no more butterflies? Making sure you're like assessing the entire effect of whatever you're implementing. Oh, right. There's always this slide that's like kind of the professional extras that you can charge for. I think this is pretty self-explanatory and I want to get to the website, but essentially you can always offer the service of spring weed cleanup, which is just, there's always going to be weeds that come after the rain. So if there is a good rainy year, you could always just offer the service of, spring weed cleanup. Okay, so I wanted to do the resources. So these websites are on your in your handout, but so this is the University of California Agricultural and Natural Resources Statewide Integrated Pest Management, which is total mouthful, but UCANR IPM for short, and you can just Google either of those, UCANR IPM, and it will come up. But it's a great resource, and it has so many things on like everything that's not just native plants, but also horticultural plants. Like your traditional kind of ornamental plants, agriculture, everything. I wanted to, well, yeah, I guess I can just show this one. Yeah, oh, right. I'm just totally brain farting. So yeah, this is their website, and you can just see it has like identifying and managing pests. What is IPM, which is like, basically, if you didn't understand anything I said, you could just read this, it'll explain IPM. Talks about exotic and native. It's just such a wealth of information. I recommend like skip one of those like YouTube wormholes and just wormhole this website one day if you're like that. Okay, and then the second one is this diagnostics tool. I just usually literally just this website I believe is on your handout as well, but I usually just Google IPM diagnostic tool and it comes up. But I have an example here. Like, this is a culinary sage, but let's pretend it's a Salvia spathaceae, because Salvia spathaceae has this issue a lot. And if I were to use the IPM diagnostic tool, it's pretty cool how effective it can be and just how helpful, especially for narrowing things down. Maybe a lot of you know what that is, but I just want to kind of show as an example with the diagnostic tool. This is just their like what to do thing. I'm going to close, but you can see these are their kind of categories that you narrow down to help the kind of diagnostic tool narrow down what pest you're talking about. So first you start with like what kind of plant type it is. You can see it's flower, fruit trees, trees and shrubs and vegetables. And let's use that example of the sage with that white stuff on it. So all you do is you just pick the thing that it makes sense for each category. So I'm going to say tree, it's a tree or a shrub. You could say flower too, I suppose, but it's kind of more of a shrub in my brain, but the algorithm will get it. So you can see I said add to my list and it shows up here. I go to the next category, which is plant names. And typically they have both genus and common name. Sometimes they don't have both. And this is a sage, I know, let's see, going down to, oops, went too far. So you can see it has sage here, but it also has salvia. So, you can add them both or either or, depending on how you feel. And then you go to the next thing, plant parts, and you say what you add to your list, what plant part is being affected by that, whatever pest. And it says here, buds, flowers, blossoms, fruit, leaves, overall, shoots, twigs, and branches. And the photo we have is typically just leaves. So I'm going to just add that to my list. You can add other things if you see it. I'm just trying to keep it a simple example. And you can see it's narrowing down my results. It's at 5 results left. So it has 5 options for me of pests. But I have my last category, which is what is the actual damage? And I would really make sure you focus on the words more than the picture. A lot of times the pictures are of different plants and it doesn't really look accurate. And just, go with the words that are stated, which here it says curled, cupped, folded. No, it's not that. It wasn't, the leaves weren't deformed in any way. So it's not this one either. Discolored necrosis, chlorosis. I wouldn't say they were discolored, so skip that. Drop or cling to branches, no. Galls, swell, no, they're not that. The leaves, powdery, cottony growth. I would say it's something like that, so I'm gonna add that to my list. And then leaves, specks, flecks, dots, stippled. You know, again, maybe not. I would say no. Spots, blotches, lesions, mottled. Maybe, you know, you can see right now I only have one thing added to my list and they only have one result. And if I am, you know, maybe I'm not so sure, I can add this too. Let's just say it did kind of have a spot. I don't know. You know, so you go to, once you've selected all the things, you go to view results and you can see it has two options here for me. It has leaf spot diseases, which, oh, this is not very, which it could be, but doesn't have any information, very helpful. I guess that wasn't a good example, but it also has powdery mildew right here on the left-hand side. And I can look through all this information about powdery mildew. And it is that this is what it looks like. And obviously this is like a rose over here. So sometimes the pictures again aren't very helpful, but they do like an identification. They'll describe it very well. So you can be like, oh, okay, yeah, it's a white powdery growth for sure, blah, blah, blah. You can you can help identify it by the information. They have the life cycle of the pest, which is really helpful. And then they give you the management and they explain management, everything from the lowest impact thing to usually down at the bottom, they'll tell you like the fungicide or pesticide. So they'll tell you all the different options you can do to manage said pest. So I think this is really, really helpful for, you know, identifying stuff. And I just wanted, I wanted you guys to be able to see the diagnostic kind of tool in action. I think I had one more example. Did I? Oh, right. If you also, you can look up things like they have a search function and say like, you know, sometimes this happens where, you know, somebody more knowledgeable than you is like, oh yeah, that's just Manzanita leaf gall. And then, you know, you're too scared to say like, what do I do about that? Or, you know, maybe you just know what it is, but you don't know what to do about it. You can also just Google or use the search function in the UC IPM website. And for example, this was just an example I showed that I know this is the Manzanita leaf gall aphid, but I don't know what to do about it. And here it shows me some more pictures and it tells you a little bit about it and, you know, as much information as it has, and it has the solutions for what to do with it. So again, I really want to encourage you to know that resource because like nobody's a pest expert, or at least I'm not. There are pest experts, but we usually don't have access to them. So it's hard to become an expert at all the pests. So definitely use that resource. Okay, and your homework is in your handout or in your student workbook, it says this one, which is you go to the 12-month calendar in your workbook, which is on page 139, and you basically note any discrepancies that occur that you've seen occur or you've experienced, and especially with insects or disease. So in the calendar, it'll tell you like, you should do this for ants at this time of year. And you might want to note if that's not correct and note any IPM strategies that you would use to, you know, fix that problem. But what I almost prefer, and I would say this is the or homework. You can do either or both. I don't care. But if this is easier, I would say do the second one. I think this is way more interesting. So if you want brownie points with me, do the second one. But you basically just use the website I just showed you, or, you know, and or the diagnostic tool to investigate a pest issue that you're having or you're seeing in the garden, or you just want to know more about, you know what I mean? Use that website and note the IPM strategies that to manage it. And I like this idea because then I get to learn also for any pest issue that you've seen. So what's it called? Just tell me what's going on. If you have a picture, great, add that. And, you know, let me know, or sorry, use the website to identify the pest and kind of whatever the IPM has mentioned to do. Don't copy and paste it, just kind of summarize it for me. Okay, so that's it for today's lecture. If there's questions, we can take those.